Hello, welcome to Epicenter Bitcoin, the show which talks about the technologies, projects, and startups driving decentralization and the global cryptocurrency revolution. My name is Sébastien Couture.
And my name is Brian Fabian Crane. So we're here today with a man that pretty much everyone I will know in the Bitcoin space, who is Vitalik Buterin. Of course, you know Vitalik as the founder of Ethereum mainly. He also used to be a writer at the Bitcoin magazine a while ago. And for those, I'm sure most of you will know Ethereum as well, but if you don't, we've done 2 episodes before on that, one with Stefan Tual a very long time ago, and one with Gavin Wood just when the Ether sale started. So thanks so much for taking the time today, Vitalik.
Yeah, thank you.
So perhaps to get started, we're not going to spend too much time sort of talking about what is Ethereum, but can you briefly run us through, maybe very briefly, what Ethereum is, and then also how it has kind of evolved from the time when most people heard about it?
Yeah, so originally when I came up with the idea behind Ethereum last year in November, I'd actually been working on some of the other Crypto 2.0 projects, or they were calling themselves Crypto 2.0 back then, but this, there are these sort of meta layers on top of Bitcoin. There are these different colored coins projects, and I saw that there were a whole bunch of projects that were trying to starting to stack up different features. They were trying to use the blockchain for other things. So there were projects that were trying to do financial contracts on the blockchain. There were people trying to do name registrations on the blockchain, and they were trying to make the platform more and more powerful. And the thing that I noticed at the time is that this idea of just continuing to add more and more protocol features, ultimately it really doesn't. It's fundamentally limited, right? It's okay, you come up with 60 different features. Here's 60 different things people can do with the blockchain. That's it. What if someone wants to do thing number 61? They need to upgrade the protocol again. And so the realization that I made is that the best way to move these kinds of platforms forward and make them more useful is by adding in a programming language. So instead of having a lot of features, you have no features. Instead, you just have a programming language, and that programming language has the ability to control money and to control a database, and then people can do whatever features they want on top. So initially, Ethereum was meant to be actually a meta layer on top of Primecoin. Then in January, it sort of migrated to being its own independent blockchain. Then, so it's a blockchain that has this sort of mechanism built inside of it where you have a special type of account called a contract, and contracts are actually controlled by code that lives inside of the system. Then, over the next few months, Gav came up with this idea of, well, I guess Gav and Jeff together sort of came up with the idea of having this Ether browser, which is a client for Ethereum. It's kind of like an interface inside of which you can view decentralized applications, basically in exactly the same way that you would view websites inside of a web browser. Then we had this idea of having 2 other protocols that would work inside of this Ether browser, which would be called Whisper and Swarm. Whisper, decentralized messaging protocol; Swarm, kind of decentralized file storage or just data storage. Well, more file storage.
And what was the idea? Why was it thought necessary to develop a browser? Because this is also such a barrier, right? If you want people to adopt it, I know you'll be able to use it through normal web browsers as well.
Right. So there's 3 alternatives that we had. Well, really 4 alternatives. One alternative is to have either an add-on or a web page, so kind of like blockchain.info or kind of like CryptoKit, where basically it's all inside of a browser and people just have an Ethereum client. And you could do clever tricks with iframes to kind of still have this aspect where you could have decentralized applications written in HTML and JavaScript, and it would kind of work inside, and it would sort of have like a browser window inside of a browser window. That's actually a route that we are developing. We do have 2 people that are kind of dedicated to this idea, to the idea of having that kind of JavaScript client, and people who want just a really lazy ability to access Ethereum from inside the same browser as everything else will have that ability. Second choice is writing a plugin, so kind of like Flash or Java. We weren't really interested in the choice, again, in part because nobody on our team particularly knew how plugins worked. In part because it's just it's kind of a halfway house solution that has some of the benefits of one approach, but some of the costs, and some of the benefits and some of the costs of the other approach. And we decided that having an independent browser is a better option because it lets us do a lot more to create an environment that's specifically tailored to these kinds of applications. So, like, one example is adding in a permission system, because with dApps you really need that, like, basically kind of almost built-in accounts, the ability to like really control exactly what dApps can and can't do to whatever accounts you have on the blockchain. It's the ability to just potentially eventually add in like other ways of writing dApps, so they don't have to be in HTML and JavaScript. So, like, we want to support standalone applications as well. So
now, how would you support those standalone applications on mobile platforms? Do you envision development frameworks for iOS and Android, for instance?
Yeah, we are going to have an Ethereum library for iOS and Android. I mean, at the very least, you could probably take our JavaScript code and port it in already, but it's obviously going to be slow. Eventually, the next version of Go, as it turns out, will have an option we'll have basically Android compatibility, so it will be possible for us to like write in a mobile client.
Yeah. So just for those. I recently, there's a nice tutorial as well, or sort of a web demonstration on YouTube of the Ethereum browser. What was the name again of the browser? It's Mist.
Mist.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll put that in the show notes as well, so people can have a look at it. To be honest, I have seen it sort of demonstrated. It does look really cool. So I do see the logic, especially because we are talking about such a radical shift in the way applications work, and they're consumed, that they're distributed, and they're paid for. So it does make sense to me to sort of develop it from the ground up, but also at the same time, it illustrates very well how the project of creating, I think, a new crypto application platform has become so huge, and has taken on so many new dimensions. It's like, oh, we're going to have to do this from scratch as well, this from scratch as well.
Yeah.
So touching on these applications, I mean, recently you guys hosted a hackathon in Berlin. It was called DEF CON. Brian, you were there, I believe, right?
Yeah, I was there for parts of it. Yeah.
So what are some of the interesting sort of projects that you saw emerge at DEF CON?
What did we saw that emerged at DEF CON? I guess, like, basically DEF CON was really an event for like everyone on all sides of the project to kind of show off what they were working on. So, like, on the one hand, we had Alex Van de Sand show off Mist, or what he was working on with Mist, what it would look like, what it would be with the with the permission system built in, with how sample dApps would look inside of the browser. Jeff talked about that as well. The guys from Poland that are doing a virtual machine talked about the virtual machine. Vlad and I, who were doing proof of stake, talked about proof of stake and so forth. Most interesting things that are probably started, well, I guess Solidity, which is the contract programming language that Gav and Christian Reisweiner are working on. So that's, I mean, they got some pretty serious plans for that. They're trying to like make a language where contracts would be first-class objects, objects inside of contracts would be first-class objects, and like it even has like a built-in formal proof system. So it would have all these sort of features that are specifically tailored to the specific fact that this is a language where different people are writing programs and they kind of all talk to each other, and you really care about code being absolutely correct the first time. I mix the integrated development environment. We saw the initial plan for that. You know.
You mentioned something interesting there, contracts as objects. Is that right?
Yeah.
I never really thought of it
So,
that way. That's an interesting way to look at it.
yeah, I mean, you know, the word contract is kind of really bad terminology at this point, to be honest, because originally the reason why I called them contracts in Ethereum is because when I was working on Mastercoin before that, I had been developing, it was about financial contracts, and specifically it was about contracts for difference. And the whole idea of, you know, you having a programming language control money actually came out as the result of this approach of trying to take the idea behind contracts for difference and basically like generalize them, and you know basically allow people to bet on arbitrary mathematical formulas. And so it just kind of, the name just kind of stuck. But really, it's almost more accurate to think of them as being agents, like kind of, you know, like Kern style autonomous agents.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess some you can call them objects. I call them accounts sometimes, actors.
So kind of the bulk. So our listeners don't know what sort of the main topic of this episode we had in mind and what we really want to dive into. So perhaps let's get started with that. And just to give some brief. It seems like, judging from reading your blog posts, the one thing you've spent the most time on, you know, has been consensus systems, right? So talking about proof of work, proof of stake, what the right proof of stake implementation is. That's also one thing I came away with from DEF CON. It's just how complicated proof of stake is and how many different options there are and different possibilities. And the other thing is scalability. So we'll really dive sort of into that, and I think it will give us a nice window also in the future of cryptocurrencies. So perhaps get started off. Can you talk a bit about why this is the area where you focused on during the last year?
So, you know, I've been looking at consensus systems, and I've been looking at trying to figure out first, you know, what function they serve, what people want them for, and you know, and how, under what circumstances they can become something that people actually adopt as, you know, a fabric for substantial portions of social interactions. So the two problems that I see with Bitcoin are, number one, proof of work is expensive. So, you know, basically what Bitcoin is doing is, as I've said a couple of times, it's paying $600 million a year. That's the cost of all of the mining hardware and all the electricity, roughly $600 million per year on a 5 of 10 multisig. Because, you know, ultimately there's maybe about like five or 10 big mining farms and mining companies that control the entire network, with, especially with ASICs out. So, you know, we're paying a really huge amount. It's this incredibly inefficient protocol that basically involves miners literally competing to see who can waste the most resources the fastest. And on the other hand, it's not getting us all that much decentralization because we have this ASIC specialization problem. So with proof of work, I've been trying to at least solve the ASIC problem. So come up with a proof of work algorithm which is CPU friendly. And we've been looking through a whole bunch of approaches around that. So initially we took the memory hard route, which is, you know, trying to make something that's kind of like script but better. And I invented this algorithm called Dagger that basically allows you to create an algorithm which is memory hard to compute but memory easy to verify, which is important in making memory hardness scalable, because, you know, if it takes a gigabyte to actually perform a round of an algorithm, then the problem is it also takes a gigabyte to verify it, and it also takes a billion steps to verify it, which is completely non-viable, especially for like clients. So that's the first step. Then from there, Sergio made his post pointing out how Dagger is basically vulnerable to shared memory attacks. And so from there, you know, we went into a bunch of different routes. At first, we went into blockchain-based proof of work, which is this idea of like running contracts on the blockchain as a proof of work algorithm. Then we did this random circuit approach, where basically we would randomly generate programs, and the idea is that in order to, like, because the random program generator can conceivably create any kind of program, the computer, which would be, like, you can't really specialize for it because you're sort of specializing for everything. It turns
Right.
out that the problem is that it's turned out to be very, very hard to actually come up with a sort of way of generating random programs that actually match the kinds of programs people would realistically run on CPUs. And so, there's ASIC problems around that. So the thing that we finally settled on is this idea of IO-bound proof of work. So the idea being that the primary limiting factor is not computation, it's input and output on memory. So it's an algorithm. I mean, it actually, so the algorithm that we took the idea from is called Hashimoto. It's this thing invented by Thaddeus Druija, which is, it actually does two things at once. The first thing is it's IO bound, but the data set that you have to fetch from in order to do the computation is actually the blockchain. So it also simultaneously forces every miner to be a full node. So I came up with a version of Hashimoto that I'm calling Dagger Hashimoto, which kind of separates out it actually uses two data sets. It uses the blockchain as a data set once, and then it uses a Dagger-generated data set another time. And the point of that is that Hashimoto by itself is not really light client friendly to verify, because the light clients are not going to store the entire blockchain. So but Dagger sets, on the other hand, are very easy to. The whole point of Dagger as a data generating algorithm is that it's very easy to generate individual nodes at the bottom of the set. So I'm sort of combining those two approaches and figuring out something which is simultaneously IO bound and has this light client property that
Are there any centralization concerns with every miner having to run a full node?
Partially it increases centralization, but partially it reduces it, I'd say, because the problem is that from a centralization standpoint, okay, you're not going to be able to mine on a smartphone. Fine. But the problem from or the benefit from a centralization standpoint is that because every miner is forced to be a full node, first of all, it actually reduces the amount of speed up you can get from having an ASIC. And the reason is that, if you look at the way Bitcoin ASICs work, none of them actually have Bitcoin nodes on them. That's part of why they can afford to be so efficient. They sort of all outsource the functionality to a centralized mining pool. So the way that this proof of work algorithm forces every miner to actually maintain the Ethereum blockchain, so it reduces the benefit of doing that. And the second thing is that one of the problems that Bitcoin's having is actually full node centralization. It's that the number of full nodes has actually been steadily declining for a couple of years, and it's under 7,000 right now. And so if we can just sort of do this to artificially force the number of full nodes up, then it has a beneficial effect from that standpoint.
So another advantage, I guess, that's often been touted of proof of work is that because you can only mine efficiently on ASICs, there's no way to mine with botnets or stolen computers. So is that a concern, that you will be able to mine with botnets?
So yeah, I mean, it's an issue. In my opinion is that it's overrated. Two reasons. So first reason is that if you look at the kind of hardware that botnets tends to infect, I mean, first, it's generally really old laptops running Windows XP. So 100,000 botnet computers are really worth only 10,000 normal computers. And the second thing is that if you take over a computer, and then you still need to keep under some level of resource utilization. You need to keep under 10 or 20%, otherwise you get noticed. So really, it's 50 to 100 botnet computers are worth as much as one normal mining rig. So that's one argument. And the other issue is that if botnets actually are effective, then I think legitimate botnets are going to outcompete illegitimate ones. And what I mean by legitimate botnets basically is companies that are developing software applications will build in miners as a form of monetization. So if you download some particular thing, like, if you download, I don't know, some antivirus package, then it would scan your computer for viruses, but then it would also say mine on your computer, and it would carefully calibrate it to mine only when it's not interfering with your battery life or your other activities, and it could even give you like a cut of the profits.
Could we also extrapolate that to hardware, like embedded hardware such as smart refrigerators and smart washing machines?
Embedded hardware, probably not. Well, at least not in this specific case, because the whole point of CPU mining is the reason why it has this potential of being so decentralized is that everyone has some quantity of computing power to them that's basically free, right? So computing power up to some constant, up to some value n, you only have to pay for the electricity. You don't have to pay for the hardware. So that makes it cheap. And then going beyond n, you have to, that's the point where your first computer is up to 100%, and you have to pay for more electricity and more hardware. So it's this really weird sort of superlinear cost curve that you pretty much very rarely see in economics. So, and then like that's basically why you could actually realistically expect that home users will be able to mine, and they're not going to get outcompeted by even specialized data farms. So the problem with refrigerators is that they have no reason to have spare CPU capacity by default, and so if you put miners into them, then it's not going to be like they'll have to pay for hardware and electricity.
Yeah.
Now, the one argument that I will grant is that for heating devices, there might be a legitimate case that for heating devices, it's the electricity that's free. So actually, look, this is like the one potential salvation that ASIC mining could possibly have, is that maybe, just maybe, it makes economic sense to put ASICs inside of every home heater, in which case the whole thing actually will be decentralized again. But
Yeah, of course. Then I mean, the issue now is just going to be that you need to be able to plan ahead, right? Something like a heating device would only make sense if you can mine with that for 5 years and you have some expectation of the profit. And that's definitely not going to be there in the short or medium term. Maybe in the long term, right?
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is that it's something that could happen, right? But it's not something that we can necessarily count on. So, I mean, I really don't know enough home heating economics to say exactly how viable an ASIC as a home heater is. Yeah. And I guess the immediate problem is that they're kind of a lot more, is that an ASIC is way more expensive than just, a box that sits there and wastes electricity. So, yeah, it might be cheaper to just use boxes that waste electricity instead if you have heating. Yeah. But, yeah, it really could go either way.
Well, before we go on, so we're going to move on to proof of stake in a second, because that's kind of, I think, where it also gets really interesting to talk about that. But before, we'll just briefly do an ad about Shapeshift.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, if anybody out there has ever tried to buy altcoins, you know that it's probably very complicated and cumbersome. And one of the reasons for that is because most people that want to buy altcoins have to go through exchanges. So you have to find a reputable exchange, sign up, give them a bunch of personal information, send bitcoins to that exchange, and then place an order, wait for that order to be fulfilled. That just takes a long time to do, and it's just a hassle. So there's a company that we've been working with for the last couple of weeks called Shapeshift, and Shapeshift offers an alternative to that. And actually, last week, Alan Scott of Cointelegraph came up with this interesting analogy, which I'm going to use, and that Shapeshift is much like Google Translate for currencies, for cryptocurrencies. So actually, we're gonna demo this, because that's how easy it is. We can actually demo this within the show. Let me just share my screen here. There we go. All right, so I've got Shapeshift running here, and you'll see. So on the left-hand side, I've got BTC, and on the left-hand side, I've got Litecoins. Now, all you need to do really is just enter your Litecoin payment address, and a specific amount and hit start, and then that will generate an address and a QR code to which you send money to, and in just a few seconds, Shapeshift will send Litecoins to your account. So I'm going to get my Litecoin address. Oh, all right, let's see here. Oh, I don't have my Litecoin address handy. That's a shame. Because I probably should have prepared for this, right, Brian?
Yes.
Well,
let's do it next time. We'll do it live again.
But yeah, anyways,
it only give my Litecoin address.
Yeah, sure. if you
let's send
if you've got one handy, you can send me in the chat. I'll add it in right now. But no, so essentially how this works is you just send the amount of bitcoins that Shapeshift will specify to the address that it specifies, and in just a few seconds you'll get Litecoin on your account. Okay, Vitalik just sent me a Litecoin address. Thanks, Vitalik. All right, so let's say we want to get, I don't know, 1 Litecoin. How much is that? Start. Okay, so here it says, within the next 10 minutes, I need to send this much Bitcoin to this deposit address that I can do. The demo went surprisingly well last week.
Let me do this.
Too late, I sent it already.
Ah.
Oh, you sent it. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
So now we're awaiting exchange, and in just a few seconds, Vitalik will have some Litecoin in his account.
QR codes are really nice.
Yeah. Well, if you hadn't been so fast, you would have gotten the Litecoin for the show, but.
So now it's awaiting exchange, and there you go. So that took about 20 seconds, and we didn't have to create any accounts, give Shapeshift our email address, or wait for orders to be fulfilled. So the idea is to allow you to buy and sell Litecoins quickly and easily, and they accept a whole bunch of altcoins, so Litecoin, Peercoin, Darkcoin, Dogecoin, Namecoin, Feathercoin, Blackcoin, and who knows, maybe someday Ethereum, Gems,
Ether,
all these app coins that are coming up. So give Shapeshift a try. Go over to shapeshift.io. It's fast and easy, and we would like to thank them for their support of Epicenter Bitcoin.
Absolutely. So let's move on to proof of stake. So proof of stake is one of those things I've been sort of wanting to look into it for ages. I was always like, I always want to read about proof of stake and really understand how it works, and I'd somehow never gotten around to it. And recently I've more and more started to think about it, read a bit about it. I still feel I have a fairly poor understanding of proof of stake. I did actually read one of your, Vitalik, one of your articles, like really old article that you wrote for Bitcoin Magazine. Just the other week. It was very clear, very understandable. But of course, things have changed a lot. So, can you briefly explain to those who don't know about proof of stake what proof of stake is?
So, proof of stake basically, I mean, it is a consensus algorithm, much like proof of work is a consensus algorithm. And the point of a consensus algorithm is to have a way of updating the blockchain such that it's very hard to revert, essentially. So like you want to avoid situations where you have a little blockchain, it's growing, blocks are being added to it, and then some attacker is able to create a new blockchain that goes that starts off at some point 100 blocks back, and the attacker creates 200 blocks, and then everyone switches off to the attacker's chain, so it reverts history. So the point of a consensus algorithm is to make it expensive or to restrict block creation in some fashion, so that you can't so that people can't just create blocks at whatever rate they want, starting from wherever they want, and also try to incentivize people to work on continuing to expand one particular chain. So so time only moves forward, it doesn't jump backward. So proof of work does that by making each block computationally hard to produce. So, every time once a block gets released, there's this math problem where if you can come up with a block based on the block that already exists, such that your block has a hash which is less than like 2 to the 176 or whatever, some really low number compared to the numbers that hashes usually take, then that block is valid, and so that block jumps out onto the network. Everyone receives the block, and people start producing the next block from there. The idea behind proof of stake is that instead of the limiting factor being computing power, the limiting factor basically is stake. So stake being, coins themselves. So the simple way to describe, the really simple, sort of naive proof of stake that people were thinking about 3 years ago was this idea that you would have every single account would have a chance per second of being the accounts that has the right to create a block at some particular time, and that chance per second is proportional to how many coins that account has. So you can think of every account as kind of being like a simulated mining rig, where it's where the power of the simulating mining rig is proportional to the amount of coins in the account. So like that's basically the idea behind proof of stake. It's some kind of way of limiting block creation where your probability of being, or the amount of influence that you have in the block creation process, is proportional to how many coins you have.
I've got a question about how this actually works, because we've talked about proof of stake in a sort of theoretical sense a lot. I mean, you have in your blog posts, but in actuality, when you're mining with stake with your coins, do all of your coins have to be in one address, or can you mine with multiple addresses? How does that work?
I mean, why can't you mine with multiple addresses? I mean, any system is going to let you pretend to be multiple people. Yeah, basically, like you can, if you have an account and that account has coins in it, then there's some option that you'll be able to turn on in your client, and that option will look for opportunities when you have the right to create a new block. And if you have the right to create a new block, you'll end up creating a new block. So if you have 10 coins, then let's say the total number of coins in the system is 1,000, and let's say you have 10 coins, and it's a model where it's done on a sort of block by block basis. Then the way you would expect it to work is that an account with 10 coins, once a block gets created, an account with 10 coins would have a 1% chance of being the account that gets to create the next block, right? So, or it could be per second as well. So you could have a 1% chance of having the right to create a block during the next interval. So then if you have all 10 of your coins in one account, then that's what you have. You just your client keeps on waiting. 1% in 1% of all the intervals, you get lucky, and your client pushes out a new block onto the network. If you were to split your 10 coins up into 2 accounts, then each individual account would have 5 coins. Each individual account would have a 0.5% chance, and so basically the same thing would happen.
But so here you have one of the advantages, or the main advantage, I guess, of mining pool, right, is that it decreases the variance of mining. And obviously here you'd have a huge problem with small miners or small coin holders that, because of the high variance, they also may never mine a block.
Yeah, in every system has a variance problem. So in proof of stake, you theoretically could have stake pools. In fact, you even could have decentralized stake pools. And decentralized stake pools are interesting because, like, the way I see it is that, I think decentralized stake pools are actually, a perfectly fine and natural thing. And in fact, there's actually a market incentive for people to come up with stake pools that are more decentralized, because at least the slasher model of proof of stake, which is the model that I've been working on since, or that I came up with in January and have been working on ever since. If you end up, doing something bad, like if you end up signing 2 blocks at the same height, or if you end up mining on the wrong chain and so forth, then you get a proof that you acted in an incorrect way can actually be reincorporated into the blockchain, and then that can punish you by taking away your security deposit. So if you were to give your coins, if you were to allow an insecure stake pool the right to vote with your coins, then that insecure stake pool could theoretically end up it could theoretically end up doing something bad with your coins, at which point you'll lose your deposit and so your coins will be gone. So your incentive is to look for stake pools that are good. And by good, that means, secure, and secure basically means, not vulnerable to one particular party, which, being decentralized is just the simplest way of doing that. So
the slasher algorithm that you wrote is a way to address what we call the nothing to stake problem.
Yes.
So perhaps could you just explain what that is, and
so,
also perhaps give some of the challenges that remain to be solved with even with this algorithm that you've developed.
Sure. So the idea behind nothing at stake is this. So let's suppose that you have the main blockchain, it's chain A. Then chain A comes along, it's growing, and then an attacker starts off, the attacker makes chain B. And chain B is trying to, reverse some transaction or whatever. So in mining, you'd have 4 choices. Choice number 1 is you would mine on neither chain. So screw A, screw B, I'm just sitting there. Choice 2 is you just mine on A. Choice 3, you just mine on B. Choice 4 is you mine on A and B at the same time. So if
when you're mining on A and B at the same time, you're putting half of your hashing power on one.
And that's the thing.
Other. Yeah.
Exactly. When you're mining, you have to split it. You only have 1 unit of hashing power. You have to split it up. So if, let's say, because chain A is ahead, the probability of chain A winning is, let's say, 90%. Then if you mine on neither chain, you get 0 expected revenue. If you mine on chain A, you get 0.9 expected revenue because it's 90% chance of getting a block. If you mine on chain B, then you get 0.1 expected revenue. And if you mine on both chains, then it's going to be 0.5 because there's a 100% chance that either of those blockchains or that one of those 2 blockchains is going to make the next block. But you're only mining with half power on that particular chain. So because you're splitting your mining power in half, the half option is going to give you a return that's exactly halfway between the good option and the bad option. And so it makes sense to go with the good option. And so because of that, there is this rapid convergence property where if one chain has an even slightly higher chance of succeeding, everyone's incentive is to mine on that chain, and so it rapidly converges to being the only chain. So proof of stake, you have a problem. The problem is that mine on neither chain, expected revenue 0. Mine on chain A, expected revenue 0.9. Mine on chain B, expected revenue 0.1. Or rather, vote on chain A, vote on chain B. But if you vote on chains A and B at the same time, then the problem is that you're not actually splitting up anything, because you're mining on chain A with coins on chain A, and you're mining on chain B with coins on chain B. So you're actually getting both at the same time.
And
so
both chains aren't aware of the state of the other, so that
exactly
is what allows you to do that. Okay.
Yeah. So your expected return is 0.9 from this one and 0.1 from that one, so it's 1. And so rationally speaking, everyone is going to vote on every chain. So Slasher is an algorithm I came up with in January, and what Slasher does is it says, okay, what we're going to say is when you mine a block, then you are not going to get your reward for another 3,000 blocks. Now, if you get caught mining on chain A and chain B at the same time, then what happens is that anyone in the network can create a transaction, and what that transaction is just a proof a proof containing the signature on chain A and the signature on chain B at the same block number, and then they can submit that as a transaction into a block, and then that deletes your signing reward, and it also gives a third of the signing reward to whoever submitted the evidence as a bounty. So the idea there is that you're sort of explicitly punishing this chain A plus B approach, and so as a result, the chain A plus B approach has a return of 0. So since then, one of the problems that Slasher 1.0 had is that in order, so the problem is that if you're doing this sort of double vote strategy, then chances are you're not going to have an opportunity to mine on either chain, because it's a relatively low probability thing. It happens rarely. So even if you choose the strategy that you're going to vote on A and you're going to vote on B, most of the time you never get an opportunity on both. You either get an opportunity on one or you get an opportunity on the other. So even if you adopt the double voting strategy, most of the time it's still going to look like single voting because, it's probabilistic. You only see one. So the way that Slasher in January solved the problem is it also pre-selected voters. So, that's exactly it, Slasher. So if you scroll down a bit, actually scroll a bit way down. There we go. Up. See the 4 points? So,
Yeah.
So point number 2 is that or points number 1 and 2 is that you notice that the signer for the set of signers or the for block number n plus 3000 get picked during block n. So you really you pre-select who the voters are going to be. And the point of that, yeah. So just
yeah, no, keep going.
Yeah, so the point of that is that if a fork starts, the voters on chain A and on chain B at the same number are actually always going to be the same. So you always, you can either vote on both chains or you can vote on no chain. So if you're double voting, then you actually are voting on both chains and you actually will get caught. And so it makes sense to single vote and to stick to the blockchain that's that has a high probability of winning.
Cool. So that seems like a pretty elegant solution. Are there any problems with that?
So there's a small problem and there's a large problem. So the small problem is that if you select voters 3,000 blocks in advance, then you have this extra denial of service vulnerability, and you have a bit of a collusion vulnerability because the set of voters for a block are going to be known like many hours in advance, and so if they're known many hours in advance, then first of all, they might have the ability to get together and all extort the entire network and say, okay, we're not going to sign unless you give us $1 million. And the second problem is that they become targets for a denial of service attack. So both of those
just one question: how would the miners collude with one another? How would they come into contact?
I mean, they all have. It's public what their public keys are. Right, and especially with Ethereum, because you have Whisper, you'll be able to send a message to that public key directly, and they'll see it. So the way you solve that problem is, there's two approaches. One approach is the Tendermint strategy, which is you just say, okay, everyone is going to be a signer at every block. It's convenient. It actually also resolves the double voting problem, because everyone votes every block. It's not probabilistic, but it has this issue that you need a really huge number of signatures for every block, and it's going to be expensive to produce, expensive to validate, lots of data. So the other approach is the approach that I'm calling Slasher 2.0, and with Slasher 2.0, the idea is that instead of punishing double voting, you're punishing voting on the wrong chain. So if you vote on A, then if B wins, then even if you just voted on A, then your vote on A can be put into B, and that takes away your deposit. So that's all, and that generally solves the problem because it actually only lets you pick voters 1 or 2 blocks in advance. There are some other complications, like how you have a random number generator inside of proof of stake, and there's some approaches for solving that. There's the NXT approach, which basically uses absentee voters as a source of randomness. We came up with an improved version of that approach based on something called a low influence function. You can also actually take the Slasher 1.0 route. There's a built-in cryptographically secure provable random number generator in Slasher 1.0, and you can actually take that technology and compress it down to 5 blocks and make it work. So the smaller problems, they have solutions. The bigger problem is, okay, so you say that if you vote, then, or if you produce a block, then you get your reward after some number of blocks. So, and before that, if someone comes up with proof that you cheated, then your reward gets taken away. Problem. what if you start a fork, or what if someone starts a fork that's so far back in history that everyone who voted at that particular time already got their coins taken out of the deposit. So the deposit doesn't exist anymore. They have their money, and there's no way to punish them. Then once again, there is no incentive for them not to sign on, every attacker's fork. So this is called the long-range attack problem. So the issue is, what if you have a fork that starts really, really, really far back? Like, it could even be as far back as a Genesis block. You could have a situation where someone goes to each and every one of the participants in the currency's Genesis sale and asks them it tells them, I'll give you $5 for your private key. So all of the participants in the Genesis sale, they're going to be fine giving up the private key because, they have the ability to, even if they're still using the private key, they have the ability to just switch to a new one, right, and move their coins over. And then they'll say, oh, sure, it's my private key, I'm not using it anymore, here you go, thanks for the $5. So, okay, attacker pays $5 times a few hundred, has 2/3 of the coins in the Genesis sale, and then the attacker has the ability to basically simulate an entire history, which is indistinguishable from a legitimate history, and then that blockchain actually looks even more legit than the normal one because the attacker's nodes are online 100% of the time. So that problem, you can't solve the problem crypto-economically. I actually tried whacking my head against solving the problem and using some clever economic tricks like transactions as proof of stake, and I tried it for 2 months, but I eventually figured out it's fundamentally unresolvable. And so that's when I came up with this concept that I described in a recent blog post, which is called weak subjectivity. So the idea behind weak subjectivity is that instead of so with proof of work, it's a consensus mode that you can call it objective. So what that means is that if some new node joining the network sees the current set of blocks that have been produced, that new node will be able to come to exactly the same conclusion as everyone else about what the valid block is, because they just check, which blockchain has the highest total proof of work on it. So with proof of stake, I'm arguing that in order to make proof of stake work, you need a consensus model which is weakly subjective. So in order to define weakly subjective, I guess, so strongly subjective would be something like Ripple consensus, where there is no objective scoring system. It all depends on what each individual node's unique node list is, right? So weak subjectivity is this interesting compromise between the two, where you basically say that if you are a node and you have already connected to the network within some period of time in the past, so I'm thinking something like 3 months, or it could be 12 months or whatever, then you have the ability to come to the same consensus as everyone else just by seeing the data. But a node that has either been dormant for a really long period of time, or a node that's connected to the network for the first time, that node is going to have to basically get a checkpoint from someone. So, either yeah.
So I don't know. I wanted to ask a question that sort of touches on proof of stake from a broad perspective. And that's, so Sebastian pointed out, he sent me a video the other day, and there is that idea that proof of stake, if you explain proof of stake to someone who is maybe not from the cryptocurrency space, and they're saying, well, you vote with your coins, right? It sounds like it's very much a sort of a rich get richer scheme, right? Where sort of money controls everything, and maybe one could say this is a bit flawed, right? Because who gets to buy mining hardware? But what is your point of view on that? And
my point of view basically is that mining hardware is exactly that kind of game to exactly the same extent.
When you think about it, to buy mining hardware which would allow you to mine anything reasonable, you need to be rich. Essentially, you need to have a large amount of resources to buy that mining hardware. So we're looking at the same problem, basically, just it's displaced.
Another interesting way of looking at it, and I'm really curious how this works, right? So, because you can say that with mining, even if it doesn't solve that problem. One problem or one effect it has, it dilutes early adopters and it creates a sort of a coin distribution, right?
Right.
So what are your thoughts on distribution and proof of stake?
And that's kind of interesting because the same people that advocate proof of work are often the same people that advocate Bitcoin's finite supply model.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I do think that a growing supply would be is more optimal. But the thing is that just doing like if all you're doing is you're just having like some amount of like wasted work basically, and you're distributing coins to people who waste work. I mean, it's basically a make work program. It's not really a particularly useful way of distributing money.
Right,
So,
I agree with that. It seems like an extremely inefficient way of doing it, but still, so with proof of stake, it means basically, right, if you own like 10% of the coin in the beginning, assuming you keep mining, then you will keep owning 10%, right? Because even if there's block reward or not, if the coin supply grows or not, if you get 10% of all the block reward and transaction fees, it sort of works out to the same thing.
Correct. Yeah, I mean the only category of models that kind of get around that is the whole idea of, well, let's have the stakeholders in some, or the participants in the network in some fashion decide who to distribute coins to in order to pay for ongoing development. So like BitShares DPoS is probably the one sort of live implementation of that kind of a mechanism. So, I mean, that's an interesting set of strategies that could be promising.
Cool,
Yeah. Aside from that, I mean, in general, I don't think. I mean, if people are looking for fairness and egalitarianism out of cryptocurrency, I mean, ultimately, the people that need that the most are like people in Africa that are on living on $1 a day, and they don't even have access to laptops or ASICs or coins. And so, if we're looking at this as an egalitarian revolution, it's not going to come from the currency issuance. It's going to come from the fact that this is technology that massively lowers barriers to entry to participating in a whole bunch of systems.
Exactly. I mean, I think the one thing, and you've written about this as well, but let's not go in there because it's a whole other discussion. But if you could verify that someone is a unique person, then you could have a cryptocurrency that just gets issued, like let's say in a monthly rate to all unique people, and then that could be very revolutionary in that way.
Exactly.
So I know your view is, and the view of many people, that proof of stake, at least assuming all these things get figured out and it gets tested and it really works, that it in the long run superior to proof of work. So do you think, first of all, is it technically possible that Bitcoin would switch to proof of stake? And do you you see any plausible scenario that there could actually be a consensus to that a majority of hashing power
Okay, so technically speaking, it's entirely possible. So, I mean, it's actually a bit of a misconception that it's the majority of the hashing power that decides who controls the protocol, because ultimately, if we all decide that SHA-256 is a bad mining algorithm and we should instead use SHA-3, and Gavin Andresen pushes out a version of the Bitcoin client, Bitcoin 0.10, and Bitcoin 0.10 says that a block is that blocks up to block number 400,000 are valid if they use SHA-256, and above to 400,000 they have to use SHA-3. And if everyone downloads that client, then once block 400,000 hits, even if there's only like 4 people mining SHA-3 and there's this entire industry of ASIC hardware mining SHA-256, the fact is that entire industry is going to be producing invalid blocks, and the 4 people that are running SHA-3 are going to be, producing valid blocks. And so the 4 people that are running SHA-3 are going to win. So it really is all about the users and not the miners. So
the mining industry basically has very little say in mining algorithms or whether or not we go to proof of stake or any other proof system.
Exactly.
They would be very happy about it, I'm sure.
Yeah, miners are going to yell and scream, but
But I mean, that could potentially have some sort of an impact on a
Yeah,
broader
I agree.
impact, not specifically with relation to their business model, but what type of impact would that have?
What type of impacts would what have on whom?
Well, I mean, the miners getting getting up in arms.
Getting shafted.
Yeah.
So a lot of
I
angry
mean,
people with the impact. That's what the impact would be.
yeah, I agree. There'd be definitely a lot of angry people. It's hard to imagine what exactly the anger would materialize into. Just because it's like their entire set of ASICs, their entire $600 million industry just instantly becomes valueless.
Oh, so that's very interesting, though. Your point, I wasn't. Of course, it makes total sense if you think about it, but I just hadn't made that realization that actually, if the users are sort of in a consensus, they can just switch over without having the consensus of the mining.
No.
The mining industry. Do you think that's what percentage do you attribute to that? What likelihood?
That's the thing. Technically, it's entirely possible. Politically, it's a bit hard. Several reasons. Number one, I think that Bitcoin is right now it's to a large extent committed to being this slow and steady coin that doesn't really whose protocol doesn't particularly change all that often. And now, if Bitcoin wants to have a niche as being a sort of like digital gold 2.0, then that's actually exactly the correct strategy to take. You don't want to rock the boat. You want to be exactly the same thing, and you want to be stable. And the fact is that as much as I think it's a horrible environmental tragedy that we're wasting $600 million a year on useless computations, gold mining is even worse because it's people wasting resources in order to acquire gold, and on top of that, you have negative environmental externalities. So, I think so. If Bitcoin takes the route of specializing in order to sort of replace gold, which I think it should, then it probably makes sense for it to just be as conservative as conservative as possible. So I mean, just being conservative is one aspect. The other aspect is that the Bitcoin community seems to be to a very large degree dedicated to the concept of proof of work, and especially to the. I think a lot of them especially feel kind of uncomfortable about the weak subjectivity idea, because I've actually debated this on forums so many times where I argue that there's this problem that a new node connecting to the network, and if a node's been dormant by more than 1 year, it has to ask some other node for a checkpoint. And I mean, it's not going to be a random node, realistically, you'll be asking a friend, you'll be looking up a block hash on blockchain.info, or you'll just get it from the software developer. And a lot of people either see this as some kind of, centralization, which I really don't believe it is, because, anyone can produce checkpoints. And other people also see this as being some kind of, quote, subjectivity or even trust, which is this, incredible, really evil thing that we're exactly. It's this really evil thing that we're supposed to have at all costs. Yes. So it's it'll be a really, really, really long road to trying to convince the Bitcoin community that weak subjectivity is fine. Probably an even longer road than basically just replacing it outright with something based on proof of stake.
Yeah, I mean, I think one issue is also, the default is to do nothing, right? So you'll just keep on in the same, and then the question is, when are you actually going to get to the point where maybe a majority says, okay, we need to do something? It's probably at the point where something really bad happened. There are a lot of alternatives already that are working, and the danger then is just it's going to be too late, right?
Yeah, what I guess the biggest dangers are, well, number one, what if okay, the thing that will convince Bitcoin to change its consensus algorithm, it's not going to be, these sort of moralistic arguments about how they're wasting $600 million. I mean, that's, it's a problem, but it's a sort of, slow boiling type of problem. It's not really critical at any point. The kind of problem that would convince them is if there is a 51% attack. So, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that, mining company actually manages to get over 50%. Entirely possible. Like, I think for Litecoin at some point there actually was one company that had 50%. They might still have that now. Another possibility is, there are backdoor tricks to attacking proof of work. Like, you theoretically, it would take $70 million to like do a double spend attack on Bitcoin just by actually building the ASICs directly. But if your attack vector was to just hack into mining pools, was to hack into ASIC data farms, then I could easily expect you, and combination of hacking, maybe even a combination of hiring a couple of agents with masks to walk into the data centers. You could easily do it on like a $100,000 or $200,000 budget. So, and the reason why that's the case is because like the fundamental. Like, actually, Vlad Zamfir, one of our researchers, pointed this out in our proof of stake panel a couple of weeks ago, is that the reason why proof of stake is superior to proof of work is because with proof of work, the disincentive to be against being malicious is capped. It has to be equal to the reward, right? If you mine on the wrong chain, then you get nothing, and that's the worst that can happen to you. With proof of stake, you could have security deposits, and so the penalty for doing something bad can be much, much higher than the reward, and so.
Yeah.
The reason why I expect a lot of Bitcoin mining farms to be insecure is because they have no incentive to be secure. If they get hacked and if some attacker takes them over for 3 hours, whoop-de-doo, they lost 3 hours of mining power.
Right.
But if we switch to so if we switch to a proof of stake model where you have very high security deposits, then everyone has a really, really high incentive to really, really care about the security of their funds, and so the sort of backdoor strategies that exist.
And of course, one big issue too is that with mining, these people care about the value of this hardware, right? You don't have this like, I own 1% of the mining power, and that sort of correlates to me having 1% stake in the currency. It's not like that, right? So,
well, it depends. Actually, that point you raised actually is the one argument in favor of ASIC mining instead of CPU mining, which is that a Bitcoin, if they have a Bitcoin ASIC, then that Bitcoin ASIC is useful for nothing else. And so what they actually, the asset that they're actually holding is actually, basically a leveraged bet on the Bitcoin price.
Right, but the problem is, what is 10% of that worth, right? 10% of the mining power. It's worth only a fraction of the total value of the market capitalization, whereas with proof of stake, potentially 10% is actually worth 10%, right? So.
Yes, exactly.
Like
that's that's kind of it's kind of another way of looking at this idea that the disincentive is, but it can be much higher than the reward, and so the amount at stake is much higher than the amount being rewarded.
So if you're interested in these topics, one good place to read up on it is on the Ethereum blog. So all the articles that Vitalik mentioned, the weak subjectivity article and the slasher, the article explaining the slasher algorithm is also there. I would say set aside a good hour and a half to read these because you have to read them multiple times. They're very complex. I mean, I have to say I read them at least 2 or 3 times before I could even grasp about 50% of what you were saying. So, so moving on. So Bitcoin has been there's been some criticism with of Bitcoin in terms of scalability. There are some scalability issues, particularly the number of transactions per second. Can you address those?
Yep. So with scalability, I see two problems simultaneously. So the first problem is the number of transactions. So right now it's at like 1 or 2 transactions a second, and it's already the blockchain's already many gigabytes. If it goes up to like 10,000 transactions a second, then the blockchain is going to be many terabytes, and the number of full nodes is going to fall down pretty drastically. So that's one issue. That basically the more people participating in the network, the more centralized it gets, and in the limit, what you have is a system that's basically like. The limiting case of Bitcoin right now is basically PayPal, because if the whole thing scales up to the point where you have 10,000 transactions a second and you're down to 1 node processing everything, then that 1 node basically is PayPal. So that's one issue. The second issue, which I think is very related, is transaction costs. Right now a Bitcoin transaction costs 5 cents, which is fine right now because PayPal's fees are even stupider. But
It's kind of expensive, right?
yeah, it should not cost you 5 cents. The internet of money should not cost 5 cents a transaction. It's kind of absurd. And the reason why it costs, like, for micro, it completely removes all the micropayment use cases. It removes most of the non-financial use cases. And eventually, my worst fear with this space is that Bitcoin is just going to get outcompeted by a centralized alternative that's managed by Google. So, once the regulators get their act together and they work with Google on figuring out some kind of digital currency, which has all the properties that normal people would like about Bitcoin, then Google will create a centralized currency, and that centralized currency will be free to send, and there's basically no more points for Bitcoin at that, except as digital gold from that point on. So the fundamental reason why both of those issues exist is this problem that in Bitcoin every node has to process every transaction. So it's because that's how the consensus database works. Is that everyone has to agree on what the blocks are, and each block has to contain all of the transactions. So there are one approach to solving that problem is you say, okay, instead of having one currency, you have 100 cryptocurrencies, and each cryptocurrency handles 1% of the funds, and if you want to transfer funds between them, then you just do a couple decentralized exchanges. So that's a solution, but the problem is that each individual chain is 100 times less secure, right? So you have this sort of Pareto frontier between, on the one hand, security, and then on the other hand, scalability, where if you have a lot of security, then you don't have scalability. If you have a lot of scalability, you don't have a lot of security. It's sort of a linear relationship. And so in that language, the way that you fundamentally phrase the scalability problem is you say, the fundamental scalability problem is the problem of figuring out how to have a larger economic weight of nodes explicitly protecting or implicitly protecting a blockchain than the number of nodes that are explicitly protecting it. So by explicitly protecting it, I basically mean the number of nodes that are actually watching the blocks on that particular chain and are actually verifying the transactions. And by implicitly, I mean the actual security level. So, in all the architectures right now, explicit equals implicit, and so you have this linear trade-off. So, but there are architectures that solve the problem. If you look at the scalability posts that I made, especially the one on hypercubes and the one on multi-chain, and the idea there is to come up with these sort of tricks where you would basically have a system where by default only a small number of nodes would actually be verifying each block, and those nodes could even be randomly selected, right? So if you randomly select 200 nodes out of a pool of 10,000, then you have this situation where, okay, each block is only secured explicitly by 200 nodes, but implicitly, in order for an attacker to take it over, the attacker would have to actually control at least 4,000 nodes in the entire network in order to have a statistical chance of being the majority in any one of these 200 node juries. And so the explicit number of nodes that are processing every block is 200, but the implicit level of security is somewhere around 4,000 nodes. So that's one approach. That's something that I call jury selection. Then the other category of approaches is to say, okay, by default, 200 nodes will look at this block, but if we notice a substantial level of disagreement, then we're going to do another. Then we're going to not count that round of consensus, and we're going to do another round on the same block using all 10,000 nodes. So by default, only a small jury. If there's a problem, then it expands to the entire set. And so that way, once again, 200 nodes explicitly, but ultimately 10,000 nodes implicitly, and they're acting as a sort of deterrent, right? So, because this deterrent of this sort of second round exists, attackers are not even going to try, and so the 10,000 nodes never actually all have to become active. So it's once again, it's a sort of, it's a sort of reserve capacity mechanism. So explicit number of amount quantity of attention is 200, and the implicit security is 10,000. So
I
so
think,
that
no.
yeah. So like that's basically a summary of scalability theory. And I could obviously go into the complexities of hypercube and multi-chain. Not sure if we have time for that.
I don't think we have time.
Maybe for another
We'll
episode.
already be running very late, but I think
No, but
it's
that's okay.
a fascinating conversation we're having. So let's totally do that. And I totally agree with you. I don't think there's any way around this, right? There's just no way Bitcoin will go. It just can't go like that, right? You can't have nodes processing all the transactions and scaling this to any size. It just won't work, right? So we will obviously have to find a different way, and it's surprisingly tricky, right? Like,
I'm curious. What are your thoughts on projects like Factom that try to address this issue?
well,
I mean, Factom is, it seems to be more going into the proof of existence category, and proof of existence is a much easier problem than actually just being a scalable cryptocurrency or being a scalable decentralized application platform, because the problem is that with Factom-like applications, the primary thing that they care about is just proving that things got into the blockchain. Whereas here you're trying to, number one, prove that things got into the blockchain. Number two, prove that things didn't get into the blockchain. And, that's a bit harder.
Okay.
So just before we move on, we wanted to thank our second sponsor and talk briefly about our second sponsor, GEMS. So you may have heard about GEMS on our earlier podcast episode with Daniel Pellet. So GEMS is it's a social messaging app. It's a bit like WhatsApp, but I like to call it social messaging on cryptocurrency steroids. So there's the cool thing really is that if you think of WhatsApp, right, they got to like 400 million users, some crazy number, and there was the only incentive people had to use this was just that it was free, it was pretty good. But what GEMS is doing is that they're sort of embedding a cryptocurrency in that, so that you can pay a reward to each time you, for example, invite a new user, you can get a reward. And it creates really strong incentives that way. And you can have a similar sort of deflationary model where, the earliest adopters have more incentives, and then hopefully over time, they'll have so much momentum that the monetary incentive can decrease. So I really love this, and I think it gives it a great shot at actually being successful there, because it has this powerful way of getting incentives right. What else can we say about that? So, of course, it also, another thing they're trying to do is sort of solve the adoption problem, because GEMS will be a social messaging app, but it will be a Bitcoin wallet at the same time. So, their view, and I think it's a very valid view, is that a Bitcoin wallet on its own, it's hard to get people to use it. It's hard to spread. But if you make it a social messaging app at the same time, and people get started off straight away using, first of all, a cryptocurrency, GEMS, and being able to spend Bitcoin from the same thing, well, that has a real shot at achieving a wide adoption. And if you think of, let's say, WhatsApp again, 400 million users, if you think of the biggest Bitcoin wallet, what's that, like 2 million users or 1 million users with Coinbase and blockchain info, you don't have to get that far to get very far, right? You don't have to get that far to really spread Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So those are some of the things I love about that. And so, yeah, so we really, really loved it. When we had them on, we thought this was a great project, a lot of potential. And what they are doing is doing something similar to what you guys have done at Ethereum, is that they're doing a crowd sale. And with the money they raise, they're further developing the application. And you can get some gems that way. And it's been going on for a while, but it's still going on for, I think, about 10 more days, I think, until the end of the year.
It's until January 5th, actually.
January 5th, okay, so another 2 weeks. And you can participate on Coinify. So if you go to Coinify, you will see the project there. And you can also check out the app at getgems.org. And on Coinify, you can participate in the crowd sale and purchase some gems.
I'm really looking forward to GEMS. I can't wait for it to come on Android.
Yeah, I really want to try it out. I have high expectations.
Well, you'll get it
So-
first because you use an iPhone, unfortunately.
Yeah.
For me.
So actually, very much tied to that, a user sent us a question, and maybe we could just do that here because it's so relevant. A user sent us a question before. Now let me pull this up. So that was a guy named Jason Redden or Redden. I don't know how you pronounce the last name. So do you think AppCoin tokenization model of fueling software endeavors should be the default for most, if not all, technology startup as a way to eliminate the need for public stock offerings? I guess one could also say as a way to eliminate venture capital and that kind of funding.
I don't think there is a single silver bullet that's going to solve all monetization problems. I think it's a matter of a matter of coming up with tools and having as large a toolbox as possible so that people can monetize as much as possible, or like monetize as many categories of good things as possible. So, in the 2000s, like we came up with this idea of, hey, we can monetize free content with advertising, and that was really great. It generated a huge amount of free content. And it created this internet where so much stuff is free that you have a library that literally contains more information than existed in the 1970s, and that was available to even like billionaires in the 1970s, and yet even homeless people can enjoy it with just a $200 laptop. So now we have this idea that with token sales, there is a way of monetizing things that are decentralized, right? So the problem with proprietary software and the problem with advertising is that you would have to in order to monetize it, you basically have to control the platform to a very large degree, and you could argue to a very large extent that's why centralized solutions have succeeded, and that's why proprietary and decentralized solutions have fizzled, because there's just not enough incentive to build one. Now with token sales, there is for the first time and plenty of intrinsic incentive to build decentralized systems. And what's even better is that, unlike what some other people advocate, that, decentralized application builders should somehow monetize by, quote, selling services, with with token sales, what you actually have is you have this alignment of incentives where the success is, or the the ability of the people building the whole thing, building the platform to continue to be successful is dependent on the token actually being useful and having value.
Right.
If they build a bad platform, then the crypto fuel isn't really useful for much, and.
Right, no, totally. And the other cool thing is that you can sort of give on that incentive to the users themselves, right? So it's not just the founding team, but you can sort of give it to everyone. And I think that's really cool. But of course I agree, right? It's a new alternative. It's an interesting alternative, as I think Ethereum has shown better than anyone. But yeah, it won't be like the only thing, but yeah, definitely so.
Exactly.
So let's talk a bit. So we're definitely running late. But we definitely want to kind of touch on some more topics because they are extremely important, extremely interesting, and they sort of, I think we arrived at a point now in our discussion where also the things we talked about before sort of led us to, and that's going to what is the cryptocurrency ecosystem going to look like in the future. And I've been thinking a lot about that, and I know you've been thinking a lot about that too, and you've written some blog posts on that, and I think one of the central issues in determining that is going to be network effects. But let's start with that question. Do you think there will be a purely digital store of value? You mentioned gold 2.0. Do you think that thing will exist?
Well, it depends what you mean by do I think gold 2.0 will exist. Like, I mean, they exist already. It's a matter of will it get widely adopted.
Right. Well, okay, let's put it like that. Do you think we will have at one point a purely digital currency or a token or whatever we call it that will have the sort of mass adoption and also the stability, and maybe those things don't go hand in hand, the stability and value, that you'd actually be able to price things in that. So let's say I would do a life insurance contract and price it in a purely digital
Right.
currency.
So if that currency succeeds, unfortunately, that currency is not going to be Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is, it has a fixed supply, and so it's inevitably going to forever be just too volatile to be a useful unit of account. It's an unfortunate fact. Like, the fact is that gold doesn't even have a perfectly fixed supply. Like, the supply actually somewhat adjusts because you can produce more of it if the price goes up. But even still, it's been going up and down by a factor of 5 every decade. That's not a stable unit of account, right? Like fiat currencies, people talk about how also bad and unstable they are, but reality is that each pair of fiat currencies, on average, I've actually looked at I've looked at a whole bunch of currency pairs. On average, the price of one random fiat currency in another, at least in the developed world, only goes up and down by a factor of 1.6 within any particular decade time span. So if a crypto coin is to become a unit of account and people start pricing things in it, it would have to be artificially stabilized in some fashion. So by artificially stabilized, I don't mean centralization. I don't mean controlled by Ben Bernanke or Janet Yellen or the ECB or whatever. I mean, I actually wrote a blog post on this, and like Robert Sams, actually before me, he made the point in his paper on seigniorage shares that sure, there are lots of things to be critical about in centralized monetary policies that we see in the real world, but we shouldn't extend our criticisms to the concept of monetary policy as a whole. The concept of monetary policy by itself is completely legitimate, right? It just means that a monetary policy is an algorithm that determines what the supply of a currency is going to be. So with Bitcoin, it's a completely inflexible supply. It's predetermined, but if you can come up with a monetary policy that is decentralized and at the same time adjusts so it's at least partially aware of what its own price is, then you actually could get pretty far, right? You could get if you have even a reasonable estimate, from things like mining difficulty, from things like transaction fees, from even things like a built-in file storage market, if you had a reasonable estimate of what the value of a coin is from inside the coin, then you could issue more units of the coin or issue fewer units of the coin. You could stabilize the price.
That's a difficult problem, though.
It is, yeah, I agree. And so there's two general categories of approaches to that. One approach is to try and create these kind of estimators that would try to lead to price stabilization. Another approach is the shelling coin strategy, which is where you use a decentralized oracle to figure out exactly what the price of a coin is relative to, it could be US dollars, could be euros, could be special drawing rights, could be the consumer price index, whatever. And you then just have a currency which issues more units if the price goes above 1 and takes units away if the price goes below 1 in terms of that index. So one problem with those kinds of designs is that in order for it to be stable going up and stable going down, you have to have a system where if the price goes down, you have to be able to take units away, right? Because if the supply can go up but it can't go down, then as soon as it starts crashing, it's just going to crash more and more and more, and there's nothing you can do about it. So, it's not going to be that bad, but actually taking away upward volatility does take away downward volatility to a partial extent. But if you want to have perfect stability, you need to be able to introduce units and take units away. So this is where this Robert Sams is sort of two currency model where you have coins and shares, and or as I call them, stable coins and volatile coins. And the idea is that if the price of a stable coin goes above 1, then the system sort of issues new stable coins and it auctions them off in exchange for vol coins. So the supply of stable coins goes up, the supply of vol coins goes down. And if the price of a stable coin drops below 1, then stable coins get absorbed, and the way they get absorbed is they have an auction and new vol coins get issued.
Yeah,
so
we're actually gonna have Robert Sams on January 5th, I think, like the first week of January, to talk about just that.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so it's a really brilliant idea because basically instead of having one coin which is volatile, you sort of split the volatility in half, and you have one coin which is stable, and then the other coin sort of absorbs all the volatility, becomes extra volatile. And whoever wants to speculate can speculate, and whoever wants to just live their peaceful lives and have a decent unit of account and preserve their value can do that. Can do that as well. So, it's like that kind of. That's actually the model I'm probably even the most interested in at this point.
So we're sort of coming up at the end, but I very briefly want to cover sidechains.
Yeah.
Can you give your view on the sidechains project?
So sidechains basically is a way of using a currency from another blockchain inside of your blockchain. So you could have chain A and chain B, and the way it works is that there's a way of locking up a coin in chain A in order to unlock a coin in chain B, and then locking up a coin in chain B in order to unlock a coin in chain A. So you can sort of freely convert them back and forth. So that project, it has a lot of potential because first for networks that are either too weak to try to bootstrap their own currency, and it allows them to sort of use other blockchains' currencies as an alternative. Do I think that sidechains will usher in the rise of Bitcoin as being the one true currency of just about everything, or even at least everything in crypto? Probably not. Actually, the one big piece of evidence I have for that is that if you look, so right now there's actually been exactly one project which was announced, which intends to be a Bitcoin sidechain that's not run by Blockstream, and that project is Truthcoin, which is a decentralized prediction market. And the thing that they did is actually this incredibly clever thing of sort of playing both sides at the same time, where they say, oh yeah, Truthcoin is going to be a Bitcoin sidechain. So guess what it is in reality? They have two currencies. One of them is a Bitcoin sidechain, and the other one they're going to be crowdselling. So,
yeah,
it's I think like just the economics alone, I think the attraction of token sales is just too good for people to prefer this, wants to take the sidechain route en masse is one reason. Another thing is there are this. People are going to want to experiment with these alternative economic models. Like I could easily see, in 1 or 2 years down the line, the stablecoin Volcoin model completely displacing the single currency model. It could very easily happen.
So tied to the sidechain things. So it seems if you look at the sidechains team, they're incredibly smart people. We've had some of them on the podcast before as well.
Yeah.
Incredibly experienced in the cryptocurrency space. And yet, I also have my doubts, similar to yours. What do you think is going on there? Do you think that their economic interests, because they tend to be very much early adopters, to what extent do you think that's influencing what they are doing?
Yeah, I mean they're influenced by an ideology that I've started to call Bitcoin maximalism, this idea that Bitcoin should be the one and only currency to rule them all and there should be absolutely nothing else. I mean, it's a viewpoint that many people in Bitcoin seem to have. I guess in a partial extent, a lot of people somehow see it as unfair that a situation where cryptocurrency wins and yet Bitcoin doesn't, or at least or Bitcoin has to, or the number of cryptocurrencies will have to increase. There's some portion of deflationism among them. There's it's probably a combination of different factors for each one. You really can't pin it down on one particular thing. Yeah, it's not sure what else. Yeah.
I think that answers the question.
Yeah.
So I'd like to. So we're about to wrap up here. It's been a long conversation. We've talked about a lot of things. I mean, we'll have to have you back on the show at some point because we've got so many listener questions here in the chat room on YouTube. There's about 50 people in the Hangout right now, so we'll have to have you back on again so we can address those questions. But before we wrap up, I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and when thinking of you and the things that you're doing in the Bitcoin ecosystem and everything that you've achieved with Ethereum. you've had a very interesting journey. You went from being a college dropout to now perhaps being one of the most well-known people in the cryptocurrency space. In my opinion, you're definitely one of those people who is addressing the issues at hand and asking the right questions and trying to think of those philosophical things that will, bring us into the future. How have you been living this past year?
I've basically spent a large chunk of my life on airplanes. It's I've been to, I think this year something like 11 countries and two or three times as many as that in cities. Like basically, like visiting all of the different Bitcoin communities and crypto communities and people who are and conferences and people who are involved in Ethereum, and I guess to a large extent just to help myself learn and to see exactly what everyone in the world is up to.
So it's interesting that you've still managed, though, because if we look at your writing, like your blog posts, I mean, I've been a big fan of your writing back to the day when you were writing Bitcoin Magazine. I think, my personal view, I think you are the best writer in the Bitcoin space. Like, you're the best person at explaining complex topics in a way that are accessible to, let's say, put it semi-technical audience.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how do you manage to find the time and the attention to write these monster-long blog posts?
I mean, when you got 8 hours on a plane, what else do you do? I can agree. Planes are probably the place where I'm the most productive. So, or trains for that. Yeah. But I mean, you just got back to Toronto from basically just touring around the world. How has that been?
It's interesting. I mean, I saw a whole bunch of different places, different conferences. I was in Israel, UK, Germany, Switzerland, South Korea just recently. It's interesting to see the kind of different emphasis that all the different groups have, like different cryptocurrency cultures, different things that people are interested in. Israel's probably was the most technically advanced. Mm-hmm. Like people that are interested in proof of stake and zero knowledge proofs and so forth. Germany has its own emphasis. London has a lot of finance. South Korea is still pretty new, but it's exciting to see what will come out of it. It's this is a global movement that we're part of. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you're definitely at the forefront of that movement in terms of thought. I really also appreciate your blog posts and everything that you've been putting out online. And but you're very young. I mean, you're what, 20, 21 years old?
20 for another month.
20 for another month. It seems like you've already accomplished so much. Where do you see your role evolving in the future?
Probably going more into research. Like I've already started getting really heavily into scalability and consensus, and I know I've gotten to the point where I'm starting to understand a lot of the issues better. Eventually, maybe write a book about some of this stuff. I'd like to see crypto economics turn into a proper, mature sort of academic discipline, roughly the same way as standard cryptocurrency is today.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's something that's sorely needed for the future. It's so fundamental, right? I mean, even with Bitcoin, we've often talked about some of the economic intricacies. Like I remember we talked about it with Jonathan Lennon, with Mike Kern, very long time ago. We talked about the sort of public goods problem of transaction fees and all that. And there's just so little research on that, right? And it's so fundamental to getting this right.
Exactly. I mean, it's. I think we definitely need a lot of research. We need to also, open our minds a bit more. Like there's this big research community that's still dedicated to figuring out these really, really tiny intricacies of how Bitcoin's going to work 40 years from now. And I think it's, I think that we really need to focus on are probably the more big picture fundamentals, like, how can a protocol pay for its ongoing development? What would decentralized governance look like? What are some of the challenges in reputation systems? Sort of all of these problems that everyone thinks about that are on some level the basics, that haven't been solved yet.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Vitalik, for joining us today. That was super interesting, and we would love to have you back on. I don't know, maybe 6 months in the future or something, 8 months.
Yeah, sure.
And hear what's been going on then. And also, thanks so much for our listeners. Now, there were some questions. We got to one of them. I don't know if there's another one we should cover. I think we will try to address those perhaps in a different context as we are running very late. But yeah, well, thanks so much, Vitalik, and thanks to all our listeners for listening. Now, we will be back a week from now. We will have sort of a year-end episode. We're not 100% sure about the format and the content yet, but it'll be same time and the same place. So
we'll definitely have to get some whiskey or something, Brian.
Yeah, we'll definitely have whiskey for it.
It's going to be a year-end episode. It's going to be a year since we first started this. Like, do you realize that we've been doing this for a year already?
Yeah, I know. It's a long time. Yeah, we've done a lot of these. So yeah, thanks so much. If you wanna, so follow us on Twitter at EpicenterBTC. We'll let you know about that. You can also sign up for a newsletter at epicenterbitcoin.com/newsletter. And yeah, leave us an iTunes review. We would appreciate that, and it helps new people find the show. Although, of course, as cryptocurrency fans, you all know iTunes is a horribly trusted place, but people do trust it. So, well, what can you do?
Release them on a DHT already.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll see you next week.
And happy